All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI. And for those of you who may not know us, AHURI, or the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, to give it its full name, is an organisation that's dedicated to housing, homelessness and cities research. And through our national university network, we undertake research that is targeted at supporting policy development for all levels of government, and also to assist industry in improving practice and to inform the broader Australian community. Before I go any further, I'd now like to invite Uncle Alan Murray to come to the stage and welcome us to his country.
Good morning to you. How are you? Some familiar faces, but also familiar director. The days when I worked for, I think you started out in the New South Wales Housing Commission. So I started after that as one of those housing workers, Aboriginal housing worker at the time. So spent something like, well, Mike, you started as an estate manager, didn't you?
It was a long time.
That was a long time, and it was the old title. So I was talking about the days when we had Bobby Edward, bless him, he passed on now, and then we're talking about what it means to get a property or a house or whatever. And the days when I worked, we used to term our housing stock Housing for Aboriginals, HFA. And the consequences of giving it an acronym meant that a lot of Aboriginal people associated with the HFA stock because it linked to, through the state and federal housing agreements and the amount of money that was poured into, local economies and so forth, and meant that those HFAs properties were meant to be passed on to individuals, then individuals onto families, and stop the movement of Aboriginal people after the resettlement program that took place in the 70s. We're talking about that before the Waterloo high-rise took effect. Were they built in your term, Mike? Yeah, I thought that was. And having that understanding is that nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. We started in housing develop in 2003. We're still waiting for it. We're at the planning phase. Anyone from DPI, if they're here, they would understand that it's taken us 23 years to get to a gateway application. And then the trimmings of that, for us to be a successful land council, it means that we've got to pay 20% to the community development levy through the State Land Council, and then another 40% to social housing on the North Shore, in the wrongest place ever, on the North Shore, where our people won't go there because if you go across the Sydney Harbour, you're either having to travel there or pay a lot of money to get over there, and once you get landed there on that side, you're discriminated because you're a black fella. Welcome to Country is about having that relationship to the land and making sure that you understand the land and the consequences for First Nations people. First Nations people have been doing it hard. And I'll say to you this, and you just remember that it's about building relationship. It depends on what side of the cohort you come from. 45% of Australians voted for us in the referendum. 55% didn't. And it puts a mockery to the whole question about sovereignty and who are the first people here. Imagine those 55% of Australians voting against it, they're in this room. Do we trust you? The answer is we don't trust you. Again, we go down this history where, before BC, putting the Union Jack on our country and then taking our sovereignty away without even signing an agreement. So our people have been suffering, like over there at North Sydney, Lavender Bay. Our people are still going there, sleeping rough, homelessly, and also around here in the city. The King's Cross situation is changing, but our people are still living rough. And then we've got people in Redfern and Waterloo, again, subject to infrastructure with the building of railway stations and moving our people off land. If our people enjoy this land and then told to get off the land, what do? And that's where racism comes in. That's where the difference of people's opinion of society about us as First Nations people. And it's the same thing with the tunnelling of roads under Sydney Harbour, and then you're having to have a tollway paid when our people have been walking on this land for thousands and thousands of years. Why should we pay a toll? And it's the same thing about renting. And if you're one of those lucky ones that got a community housing or a housing away from the social network, you're lucky because you don't pay the market rent the way it's been paid. And I understand all this because I've come from a housing background. Also, working with the University of New South Wales and Sydney University about how local Aboriginal land councils are working to change the landscape when it comes to, and we don't want to be land grabbers, that's what Muslim Council told us. That's what that radio announcer, Shock Jock, said on TUE, that we are land grabbers. This is our land. Calling us land grabbers. And to do a work on the country is you need to understand, the actual environment we live in, because it's not pretty, it's very ugly. And for us to house our members of the Metropolitan Local Land Council, it'll take us 75 years to house 150 people. But we will do it within 5 years if we get the right expertise, the right planners, the right policies to make sure we can get our land past the assessment stage, past the fire stage, past the water, and also the environment. Make sure we protect the environment. Make sure culture and heritage is all linked to one. And guess what? The rules regarding our land, we've got to shift to another policy. And that shift in policy, without not knowing this, people in our lands here in Sydney, people who got properties next to our land, believe it's their land. And they think they have a larger say. They write petitions, and that is the way it's been looking. So Welcome to Country is to understand who we are, and I pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also respect their elders, past, present, but also there are the two clans. My mum comes from Walgett, she's a Gamilla woman, my dad's from Cumbergundy Mission, stolen generation, lived in Sydney all my life, probably spent 30 years, 20 years in housing of that life, and then shifting to the aged care and then shifting to hostels in the Aboriginal sector. So with that, have a great morning. And one of those things about this great country, Gadigal country, Bidjigal country, other countries that are in the ownership of Aboriginal people, because there are 300 different clans across Australia. Here in Sydney, there are 27. Across New South Wales, there are 54. So Sydney is very highly concentrated clans of Aboriginal people. But you know what? Out of the 29, 27 clans have been wiped off the earth because of urban growth. And the problem about doing Welcome to Country is making sure that we have the sufficient numbers of elders who can do Welcome to Country properly. But as chairperson, and without a traditional owner, we become the custodians of these lands. So we're different many hats when it comes to making sure that this land is seen and respected, with the understanding that when you walk on this great land, when you leave this Wesley Chapel and you go out to Pitt Street, even though you're looking at concrete, but just imagine that this place was green, lush with old timbers and old trees, and the waterway, which was the tank stream, the water that was flowing down the street. You are walking on Aboriginal land. The only thing that's changed around here is what you see and what you get, and that is concrete, concrete, and concrete. So with that, we want to live in harmony, but we can't live in harmony because the other voices, and I'm talking about the 55% of Australians who voted against it. That's who we're against. So good morning to you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope your discussion goes well. Want to acknowledge First Nations people in the room as well, and listen to us. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Uncle Alan Murray. I appreciate your kind and generous welcome to this country. I want to pay my own respects to elders past and present. All right, before we jump straight into the session that we have lined up for today, I want to do quickly a quick bit of housekeeping. Toilets are in the foyer if you need those. We have been advised if there's an emergency and you hear any alarms just to remain here, and Wesley staff will come and direct us in terms of what we need to do. If you would like to access the Wi-Fi network, you need to find the Wesley Conference Centre network on your phone and use the password, which is Wesley1, numeral 1, exclamation mark. We'll be taking questions at the end of this session after we've heard from our speakers, and we'll have a couple of roving mics in the room here, but we've also got people who are joining us online for this conference today, and if you're one of those people, welcome to you too. Instructions on how to submit a question will have been received, I hope, by you in the email that you would have got providing the link to join the conference today, so please follow those instructions. Basically, where it says submit your question here, that's where you type your question in, and so after we've heard from our speakers, I'll moderate some questions both from online and in the room. Well, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today about circular economy housing under the theme Making the Shift. We've got an exciting program to work through, and a wide range of perspectives have been gathered to provide input to us today. AHURI is very excited to have published last year a major new suite of research on housing in a circular economy. Circular economy itself is not a brand new idea, but the application of that concept into Australia's housing system is still very nascent. And so at a time when housing is very much the policy topic in the media and in parliaments around the country, we're very keen that alongside the very pressing issue of affordability and access to housing, we also remember that there's an equally pressing issue here about the use of our scarce resources and our changing climate, and how our housing system plays a role both in exacerbating those problems, but also potentially has a role to play in terms of being part of the solution as well. So that's what we're here to discuss today. In the first session today, I have my two speakers down here. First, it's Lisa McLean. She's the CEO of Circular Australia. And then the second speaker is Professor Ralph Horne. He's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation in the College of Design and Social Context at RMIT University in Melbourne. And Ralph was the lead author of the suite of research that we delivered last year. So, kicking us off, I'd like to invite to the stage Lisa McLean. And Lisa, please welcome. Lisa is the CEO of Circular Australia. And if you want to read more about Lisa, in the conference portal, you'll find a full bio of her there. Thank you. There we go. Just need to click that.
Thanks, Tom. It's fantastic to be here with all of you talking about circular economy. This is a really important systems transition that the world's going through, and so really excited and impressed with the leadership of AHURI in this space. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations leaders here with us today. I also want to acknowledge the special role that our First Nations people have played as practitioners and custodians of circular economy through millennia, and we have a lot to learn from First Nations approaches to regeneration, to economy and other things. So this slide sort of says it all. As Tom said, we're running out of natural resources. The critical minerals list continues to grow, and 90% of the things that we make, we waste. And we lose those materials either through landfill, burning, or just not utilising them. So a lot of infrastructure, a lot of stock, building stock, that is inaccessible to us. And so this massive waste, 90% of waste of what we're producing, means that our circularity rate, the materials that can go back into the economy, is sitting around 7.2%. And clearly this is totally unacceptable and unsustainable. And just a couple of years ago, that number was 9%. A year ago, it was above 9%. So we're actually going backwards when it comes to circularity. In Australia, the rate is very similar. It's around 5.4%. We are a very big waster in Australia, and this is largely because of our economy. We have an extraction economy. We rate lower than Uganda on the Economic Complexity Index because we dig everything up, we sell it overseas, and then we import everything else. And this is a major issue for Australia now in terms of achieving better resource productivity and reducing the wastage in our economy. And we know that improving resource productivity is really critical. Modelling shows that it can increase, that a 3% increase in resource productivity has these really important benefits in terms of improving GDP, creating jobs, and also improving trade balance. So it's really important that Australia improves its performance and productivity, and this means we do need to change our economy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. First, I want to talk about circular economy. What is it? Circular economy is about decoupling economic growth from that consumption of finite resources, and it's based on, and designing out waste from the system, but it's based on these three principles: design out waste and pollution at every stage of production, use and end of life, keep materials at their highest value in the economy for as long as possible, and regenerate natural systems. So these are the principles through which the circular economic framework has been adapted. And governments are rushing to embrace circular economy. I've just come back from the World Circular Economy in Brussels. 10 years ago, there was probably a handful of countries that attended this World Circular Economy Forum. Now we have almost every country represented. The reason why governments are moving to embrace circular economy is it's really the only economic framework we have to transition our economy for success in a resource and carbon constrained future. It's kind of all we've got. And you can see that a lot of the G20 countries now have overarching strategies, and Australia is working on its. Circular economy, not only does it enable us to grow in that resource and carbon constrained future, but it's also about tackling these critical crises that we're facing, along with that depletion of natural resources, its biodiversity crisis, and the climate crisis. It's caused by consumption and our linear models. The other really important thing about circular economy, it's sort of the hello for many governments and companies, is that it's about reducing carbon. And we know that more than half of the emissions that we need to cut will come from that energy transition. So as we electrify, go into renewable energy, but we're still stuck with about 45% or more of emissions that are embodied in products, in food, the way we make, use and dispose of them. So even if we were to achieve our renewable energy transition faster, the majority of the emissions that will be left are embodied carbon. And this is where we really need a circular economy to unlock and reduce those carbon emissions. Housing has a huge role to play We know that building activity is a massive creator of carbon emissions and also a huge amount of landfill. And in a country like Australia, where we, as I mentioned before, we don't have that onshore infrastructure capability for manufacturing, reprocessing, remanufacturing, it just means that everything's going to landfill, or a huge amount is going to landfill. But in landfill, there's resource. So now, there's more gold and silver in a tonne of iPhones than a tonne of ore from a gold or silver mine. Think about that. So if you're in the business of extracting gold and silver, you're going to find more of it in a tonne of iPhones. So we need these systems, we need this infrastructure, and we need to keep these resources in Australia. The depletion of natural resources is now a national security issue for countries. We dig it up, we sell these resources overseas, we're not going to get them back. They will go into more sophisticated circular economies like Europe, other countries, Japan, China, and we're not going to see those resources and minerals and metals back in Australia, the things, that critical minerals and metals we need for our own development and our own transition to a renewable future. So keeping these resources onshore, keeping them in the economy is absolutely critical, and this is why we're seeing countries and companies embracing circular economy and prioritising it. The Australian government, along with states and territories, set a target for circular economy, which is extremely exciting. They set that target for 2030, to create a circular economy by 2030. And what they agreed to do is work with the private sector to create markets, to design out waste and pollution, create markets for these secondary resources that we've just been talking about. We've had a series of meetings. It's been Tanya Plibersek, the Environment Minister, that's been running this agenda. And very cleverly, she's engaged with her cabinet. She's brought through the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, the Trade Minister. You can see the meetings here around sectors. And this is very, very important because circular economy is a systems transition. A lot of things need to happen at the same time. And we can't just rely on an environmental policy. It really needs to be a whole of government economic policy to make this transition. The Minister also set up a task force, an advisory group, which I'm on, and we've been helping to inform Cabinet and Tanya Plibersek on what are those levers, policy levers, financial and economic levers that need to happen to move Australia to 2030 to a circular economy. It's an enormous opportunity. PwC did some research here around almost a $2 trillion economic opportunity for Australia, and of course, hundreds of thousands of jobs. So the federal government's been responding to this. We've already seen a couple of announcements around circular economy, the embedding of circular economy principles in the net zero sector transitions plan. So any investment, any movement there needs to consider circular economy. And also the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, which is going to be critical for us, our ability to compete in this resource and carbon constrained future. We need this investment to manufacture, remanufacture onshore, Australian made, Australian remade. So these commitments by the federal government are very welcome and really essential to us transitioning to a circular economy. We have our appointment as advisors was for last year and this year, and we've just put out our interim report, which I'd encourage you all to have a look at. I'm going to talk a little bit about it today, but the report makes a series of recommendations about enhancing materials efficiency, reducing energy demand, minimising waste, and of course achieving net zero emissions. Things that are really critical to your sector, particularly around the construction piece. The advice that we provided spans across the levers that government has to influence around targets and indicators, national policy, economic policy, and the built environments there too. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but enough to say that creating a national framework, a national policy setting is absolutely essential. We can't do anything without that roadmap. So what we're advising the Minister and Cabinet to do is to embrace a strong definition, a set of metrics that can measure circularity so we can check how our progress is, and we can monitor that, because we're not going to get anywhere unless we've set some targets and can measure it. We also need to understand what are those competitive comparable advantages of circular businesses. Circular businesses are in their infancy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that further on, but circular businesses are things like as-a-service models. How can we get what we need without necessarily owning it? So lighting as a service, you will have seen in the industry for years, recycled water, energy as a service, and there's even facades, building facades as a service that's being developed in Europe, which we'll see more about towards the end of this year. So how can we actually get what we need without owning that asset and making sure that the residual value of that asset is retained? And there's many businesses that have been around for a long time succeeding here. Caterpillar, the agricultural infrastructure machinery business, has a circular model. It always takes back its machines at end of life, and it can break them down like Lego, recreate them and extract and retain that value. And this is the sort of thinking we need with every single piece resource that we have and in every way we use it. But it starts in Australia, this transition, with a policy framing and the targets. The economics is really important, and we've been working with the Treasurer and Finance departments to think about how we can define circularity. It's one thing to understand, have taxonomy, financial taxonomy around carbon reduction, but we need to have these circular goggles on and understand what's the impact of rolling out even more solar panels when we know that they can have very short lives, they go straight to landfill, but inside them is silicon and silver, glass and aluminium, and we need to recycle that. So the circular element is absolutely critical moving forward, and it's just not enough to be thinking about carbon. So getting the economics right will be good, and we'll see some thinking also around bonds. How can we enable green or circular bonds to be activated? And the risk reporting is another one. This is something that the European banks are a little bit more progressed in, and Circular Australia is getting quite involved in how we actually measure the risk of a circular business. What's happening to the waste? Who owns that? Who has that responsibility for the waste at end of life? And of course, in Europe, extended producer responsibility is a really big one. This means that if you're making anything, it has to be designed to last, it has to be able to be broken down at end of life, and it needs to be able to be repaired. And the IP for repairability has to be available. So I've talked a bit about net zero already. This is the piece around extended producer responsibility and designing things for disassembly. They're very important, and I hope today, each of you, if you haven't heard about this before, will read this report that's been developed by AHURI. It's cutting edge, and it's really starting to help us think about how we can not just improve our materials efficiency, but also reduce costs. Circular business models, like as-a-service models I talked about, can be very good in terms of the price point. They can lower the price point for the consumer, and they can also increase the revenue stream for the company that's producing or providing that service. And we're seeing it in fashion as a service as well, where people take out a subscription model to get those garments. They send them back at the end of, if they want to keep them for a couple of months, they pay for a couple of months. But the price point's lower and the garment stays in the economy, and then there's jobs that are catalysed around that to repair and reuse. And the same we want to apply when it comes to the built environment. And this is here as part of the interim framework because in Australia it's an absolutely critical sector. There is so much waste, there's so much investment going into our built environment that we need to get it right. So some of the things that we've made recommendations to the Minister to do is that all ministers have this responsibility for developing their net zero plan and considering the built environment, that they refurbish over demolition. So how do we keep buildings standing as long as possible to refurbish? And we're seeing some great examples at the high end of construction in Australia. But how do we make this business as usual? How do we design for that modularity that I talked about and disassembly? Facades as a service, they can be dismantled after 20 years, 10 years, 30 years and repurposed somewhere else. We're seeing this in Europe and other jurisdictions. How do we include that recycled content? And of course, there's been an announcement about that, which I'll talk about in a second from the federal government, which we welcome. And divert waste from landfill? Does it need to go back there? Where are those other markets, and how can we work together as an industry to develop those markets? Of course, benchmarks and targets are really important, and you can see there's some other really critical components here in this built environment recommendations that we've made for government. We also are very keen for states and territories to embed circular principles in their federal funding agreements. How can they start to measure the circularity in these agreements and link them to funding? So recycled content first policy, and also embodied carbon. The Australian Building Codes Board is updating the National Construction Code about embodied carbon, and this is absolutely critical because we can't just account for carbon from the renewable sector. We have to account for the creation, use and loss of these materials as well. So the great announcement and response, immediate response from the Minister and Government to our recommendations has been this circular procurement program. So from July 1, 2024, businesses bidding for Australian governments, construction services above 7.5 million need to agree to the following. So they've got to reduce or repurpose waste. They've got to replace that single-use materials with recycled materials. And then, of course, this is going to be expanded beyond the construction sector. We'll be looking at textiles and ICT, furniture and fittings and other equipment coming up. So you can see where we're heading. And this also reflects where Europe's at. Europe's leading, the EU is leading on the circular economy. They introduced in March some design specifications, these responsibilities that I talked about for producers. If they're making something, it's got to last, got to be broken down. So you can imagine we're going to start to see this in Australia. I've given you a little bit of a flavour of our interim report. We're still meeting with different sectors, but by the end of the year, we'll have some more requirements that we'll be asking the government to announce and implement. So this is where we're heading. Finally, and for many of you who've been around for a long time in this sector, it's back to the future, because that valuing those resources is something that we have done before. This idea that we can single-use things and throw them away has no economic future, and we need to realise that and embrace circular economy. I've talked about that a little bit. I wanted just to give you some examples of what circular business models look like in the industry. So dematerialising, this is where we can switch to lightweight filaments and options instead of and replace cement with supplementary materials and steel. We're starting to see movement here in Australia around this, and I'd encourage you to learn a little bit more about dematerialising. The as-a-service solutions, I've talked to you already about lighting as a service, energy as a service, and of course DEF's work in Europe around buildings as a service. But there's lots of opportunities here. There's opportunities for Australian businesses to take some of these ideas and build them in Australia. We also know that the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund is open for business. It's providing money for infrastructure and processing, manufacturing onshore that can start to tackle circularity. So how can we access that to activate new supply chains? One other idea I wanted to leave you with is some flexible circular housing options. And one of our partners, Sevco, is designing these eco-villages, which are circular with their utilities. They're looking at local agricultural food sources, recycled water, zero waste, shared mobility, a building society model. And I know you'll hear other discussions around this later today. And also catering for not just permanent dwellers, but other categories like nomads, people that, affordable housing and social housing as well. So these are just some of the models that our members are looking at. And what I want to leave you with is some thinking around what your project is going to be. How are you going to embrace circular economy moving forward? And if you have any questions, if you want more information, please look me up. Circular Australia is a peak body. We have about 380 members. We have a number of task forces around infrastructure and precincts, industry. We have a finance and investment task force, and we also have a task force with all the state and territory governments. So we're looking to support the transition to a circular economy, and I'd welcome any questions from you, and if you're interested in joining us, let me know. But I'd like to hear more from you, Tom, especially about that report. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. That was a really great introduction to today. You've really clearly presented the circular challenge. You've also talked about the work that you and your colleagues are doing and given us a good understanding and overview of the policy landscape and the initiatives that are underway at the moment. So our next speaker then is Professor Ralph Horne, and Ralph, as I said earlier, led the research that we had the pleasure of publishing last year with obviously a group of other colleagues. I'm sure he'll name them. But Ralph, we're looking forward from you to hearing a bit of an overview of the research and its findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Lisa. That was wonderful, and I couldn't have asked for more in terms of priming us, throwing down the gauntlet. And I'd also like to say I'm very privileged to follow Uncle Alan Murray and his opening remarks, which I found very a wonderful welcome to country, and I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people and that I'm on the stolen lands that were never ceded and always will be Aboriginal land. And I, in a sense, have an easy job once I've worked out how to click this thing, which is to simply talk about a report which I know you've all read from cover to cover. In fact, I could just ask you questions about it rather than talk about it. For those of you who might not have done that homework, I will go through a brief summary of bits of it. Is that okay? Yeah, I'm too short, basically. I will try and spice up that for those who have read the report by adding some of my own opinions along the way, which aren't in the report, and I'll try to make it clear when I'm doing one and the other. Just one other respectful comment from me. I just want to acknowledge Jeff Robinson, who's been a huge mentor for me and was sadly lost recently, and many of you will know him. I just want to kind of pause to acknowledge his life and his significant contribution to what we're talking about today. So my presentation is going to be in 4 parts. I am not going to read the list of contributors, Tom, because that would take me half of the 20 minutes. But they are there and they're on the reports, and I really want to acknowledge this was a group effort amongst a bunch of universities by a large number of researchers, and I want to acknowledge each and every one of them, and of course AHURI, who made it happen. There was also independent panels involving a number of organisations that have already been mentioned here today, people from the industry, people from CSIRO, etc., etc., and they were all very much part of this process. So I'm just a figurehead here, and I'll really split what I'm going to say into 4 things. A bit on the kind of setup, the rationale, but definitional stuff that follows on from what Lisa's just said. And in fact, funnily enough, I kind of thought out loud, almost as Lisa was talking, that, you know, the simplest way to reduce that 45% of embodied energy in housing is to double its lifespan. And I'll say a little bit about that because, of course, a bunch of work that was done in this inquiry is really about that topic of durability, of lifetime. And I think you mentioned build to rent on your last slide, and you know, I have a question. Build to rent, which is controversial, of course, and is complex, might be a form of product service system, and might be worth thinking about from an extended producer responsibility kind of perspective. So those are sort of one of many things I thought as Lisa was talking and gave a segue into this discussion. But basically, set up, and then I'll talk about the inquiry a little bit. I'll talk about the outcomes a little bit, and then I'll just draw some conclusions. So basically, I'm not going to talk to this slide because I think Lisa's done a far better job than I would ever be able to do about the climate crisis and about circular economy and the imperative. The inquiry itself really, it actually took us a while to arrive at the question. I think we're all housing-related people in the room, and I don't need to talk about tenure typology and God knows what else in housing. It's just very, very complicated. And how can a transition to circular economy in housing be implemented to provide more sustainable housing touches on all kinds of issues to do with distribution, access, affordability, as well as, of course, big questions about carbon and related. So our definition for the inquiry, different to any other circular economy definition, but one that hopefully took into account much of the definitional work that's been done here. But we decided that housing that is produced and consumed utilizing closed-loop principles, prioritizing local employment, resilient and functional design, and carbon neutral or energy efficient in operation. There was a lot of discussion about the extent to which equity, distribution, affordability is or is not implied here. I don't think we can tackle housing questions without joining these things together, and it's easy to say and hard to do, I know, but I just don't think we can back away from that complexity. Otherwise, we do end up solving one problem and doubling another, frankly. So again, I don't think I need to talk too much about this slide. Really, the fact that many levers have to operate in sync around workforce training, around new forms of materials, new forms of provision, and of course dealing with the question of supply and distribution of housing at the same time as its performance from a carbon point of view and from a housing service point of view. Again, before the inquiry started, we kind of thought about what is the smorgasbord of levers that are available, in a sense, in the economy and to government at various levels, all of whom have a hand in housing, of course, in one form or another, that could be looked at. And this, in a sense, was our kind of options plate as we work through a series of projects in the inquiry, which I'm going to talk about now. So how was the inquiry structured? There was an overarching team, a team led by myself out of Melbourne, out of RMIT, and there were 4 projects that were led by different universities in the consortium on 4 specific topics, not aiming to provide a comprehensive view, but aiming to, in aggregate, provide enough evidence across the housing system as to what we need to do. So the first project looked at housing at a neighbourhood scale. So this is taking into account the gaps between housing, the fact that the planning system is very much involved in housing, etc., etc. If you like, the precinct scale, for want of a better framing. The second project looked at apartments as a typology. And given that half of our new housing provision is of this typology, this is a big issue. It may not be the major part of our existing housing stock when you look back 100 or 200 years, but it's definitely the major part of our future. And we're building a lot of it. There was a discussion about retrofit within that project as well. The third project was entirely focused on retrofit, and for those social housing providers in the room, we focused entirely on that asset class, on that particular tenure class of housing. and the unique challenges faced there in bringing that stock into condition where it is suitable for a carbon neutral future, as well as all the other things that social housing needs to do, and there's no money to do. The fourth project was looking at the supply chains, and needless to say, I can't agree more with Lisa's comments that all of our housing is made of stuff, and where that comes from, what it is made of, and what embodied carbon goes into it. As an old LCA person myself, is absolutely crucial in configuring what's possible and what the ultimate footprint of our housing stock is going to be. So across those projects, we asked each project lead the same 5 questions. So this is where we're trying to do the kind of horizontals across to form an inquiry instead of having 4 projects. And we, these are the 5 questions. So how are housing producers organised? What drivers and dynamics are critical in shifting demand? What needs and opportunities are there for workforce training? What financial, fiscal, regulatory and policy instruments are currently used and might be used to advance circular economy? And what are the key innovation challenges and opportunities from a kind of industry 4.0 perspective, if you don't mind me using that rather kind of catch-all, what's happening in the new and digital and so on. They were our 5 questions, and we asked those same 5 questions. We actually had a specialist leading each of those 5 questions, and they each wrote a scoping paper, and the project leads had to read the scoping paper and respond to it in the context of their project. So that's kind of how the inquiry was structured. So the scoping papers are those things at the top in that kind of puce colour that, as it's come out here, that I've just mentioned. There was then a discussion paper produced by, frankly, myself and my team, the overarching inquiry team. We then fronted up to a panel, which was set up by Michael and the team at AHURI. We had to answer to the panels, or let me put it another way, we had valuable input from the panel members. And I should say, I won't mention the names, but there were people in that room from what I'll call the waste sector, and obviously the housing sector and the construction sector, who knew nothing about each other's worlds. And that, in a sense, that kind of tells us some of what we need to know about what needs to happen in our whole world, not just a sector. The way we think and talk about and work, and this is kind of the issue, Lisa, I think is really pitching to us, the gauntlet. Then there was another cycle of all of this. As we collected the empirical data in the projects, we produced another discussion paper, came back to another panel. And that really is what gave us the material and the wherewithal to produce what is a series of reports. And as Tom said, they are available freely to download. We also tried to, for people that prefer pictures, we produced a comic, which I actually have had lots of interesting feedback on, and so I'd like your feedback on it as well. So part of the homework, a visual summary is what we've called it, but it looks like a comic, produced by a wonderful graphic artist who has nothing to do with housing except living in one. But who we worked with in the study. Really now I'm going to shift to talking about outcomes. Just looking at time halfway through. It's about right. So trying to draw together the various hairs that we set running in the inquiry was, I will say, was probably the kind of the toughest bit. We met as larger and smaller groups and thrashed this out. Julie Lawson, I'll probably single her out and say, who provided enormous value here, is based in Europe, is working with Housing Europe, but was part of our inquiry team, made an enormous contribution in filtering some of our best practice case studies that we'd collected from across Europe and kind of made sense of them for us and brought them in to the inquiry and helped really shape what we decided to call it a quadrant framework for no other reason than we'd got 4 pillars. Sorry, it's not particularly sophisticated, and that's not really I see as my job. The first one, but however, the order of them I think is important. So I'll try and emphasise this point. We have to rethink how we value things, not just services and processes, but things. And I'll come back to that point. Perhaps more predictive, or predictable rather, is the fact that we need to shift markets. This is not going to be something that is driven by concerned householders or even concerned housing providers. That's crucial, but that's not what's going to deliver the circular economy. We actually have to shift markets. We have to somehow reflect the cost of carbon to us as planetary beings or beings on a planet in what we do. Otherwise, we'll continue to do the wrong thing and ruin our kids' futures, etc. So that's kind of an obvious one. We have to reshape markets. There's a big question about how and when and where and how that fits with regulatory settings and so on. But it also has to come in concert with tilting investment flows. And finally, capacity, which we might think of as basically skills, knowledge, and training. I think those of us who have hung around the housing sector and the building sector would probably have our own views about how broken the apprenticeship system is, how lacking we are in labour supply of various skill levels, and I think doing the maths on how to deliver what is the gap in housing supply with the labour force that we've got tells us we've got a real problem. We haven't got enough people, we haven't got the right way of doing things, and we haven't got enough money to change it. So that adds up to a significant building capacity issue. So first of all then, reappraising value. I think this greater awareness of circular economy in practical terms on the ground, if you like, taking what Lisa said and locating it within the lived experience of everyone in the housing system on production and consumption sides and across both, is essential. This is a huge job, and it doesn't happen by clicking a particular switch or a particular lever. It's about discourse, it's about the way we think and the way we talk and the way we see ourselves. So this is a big one. A penny drop for me in the GFC, there were spikes, unpredicted spikes in building material costs. As we all know, we rocked up to Bunnings and there was no timber one day, What's happened? Building firms started going to the wall, very serious, and serious job losses and serious changes. And all this was blamed on really COVID affected supply chains. And building materials became way too expensive for the sector, who were locked into contracts due to various legal, very well-meaning legal frames that we have here in Australia. But reality is our building materials have been way too cheap for way too long. And we need to get used to the idea of having really expensive building materials compared to what we thought they were, because they are expensive. We either pay for the full cost here, or we get the planet to pay the cost, and we use the materials cheaply. So there are kind of learnings to be had from this. What does that mean? How do we reframe and rethink those contract relationships? How do we think about the cost to us and the cost to the planet of building materials? The shaping markets one, as I say, is probably a little bit more straightforward. So I'm going to skip because I'm conscious of time and take it as read. The tilting investment flows is really about getting new forms and frames of capital into the housing system. I know there's a lot of effort in this space and already underway, and said even since the inquiry was produced, people like Lisa and others are already kind of doing leading the way on many of the kind of recommendations of the inquiry, as I'll come to in a moment. But this is necessary. I've really already talked to building capacity a little bit at a high level, so I'm going to skip. So for each of the 4 projects, then we came back to the verticals and started to look at, for each of these quadrants, what needs to happen in each of these 4 projects, which gives us slices through what I would call the housing system, and enable us to think, okay, these 4 quadrants, what needs to happen in retrofit? What needs to happen in apartments? What needs to happen at the precinct scale? What needs to happen in the supply chains? And there's a lot of detail in your homework, whether you've done it or whether you're going to do it, which I don't have time to talk about today. But needless to say, you know, this is what I'm talking about. So at a precinct scale, a set of, if you like, recommendations that fall under that quadrant framework. This is all downloadable in exactly this form. This slide appears exactly like this in the report. So if you don't capture it on your phone, don't worry. Just get this QR code or type it in, and it will come up. Again, for apartments, here there are, I mean, there's quite a lot to go on. There's a lot happening. Overseas, there's our exemplar projects already here in Australia. There's places to look for ideas, and there are, I mentioned build to rent before. I mean, I'm not going to open a can of worms in this, but I'm very happy to go into questions and conversations throughout today. I'm really just trying to provoke you and set up those discussions that I expect us to have. I'll just, sorry, if you want to go at this. Again, a set of recommendations in the apartment sector, knowing that it's a lot of different sectors and it's kind of heterogeneous. It really just describes a typology. And of course, retrofit actually slices up even more because we've been building apartments, at least walk-ups, for quite a long time. The social housing sector, again, it's a brutal generalisation, but we've applied the same kind of thinking to that project and got those researchers to use this framework and to apply it to the empirical work they've done. And then finally, and definitely not least, is the supply chain. In a sense, the supply chain project is quite novel. AHURI has not been able to and do much work on supply chains over the years, and so I'm very pleased we were able to, and this is in some ways the most substantial project of the 4 in terms of the insights and the connections to circular economy. That might sound predictable, but actually some of the outcomes are really, I mean, this is definitely worth a read, this report. I'm still working my way through it. I'm still trying to publish articles out of it. There's an awful lot of data there. We worked with the University of Wollongong on LCA. We did a lot of work on the characteristics of different building materials, and as Lisa said, steel and concrete are right up there as obvious, particularly if you're building upwards, and there's just a mountain of work to do in supply chains for all kinds of different reasons. So I do have to wrap it up because otherwise Tom's going to start abusing me. And I would say that in encouraging you to pick up some of the threads here that are running, I kind of think, I think one of the, maybe I'll just try and highlight from these what I think are some blind spots in our journey, getting on the bus, as it were, to circular economy housing. Clearly, one for me is disclosure. So if we think about retrofit, even housing researchers have no idea what the property condition of the Australian housing stock is. We have no database. We have no single point Despite all our efforts over many years and lots of different databases, we actually don't know. We don't have a mandatory disclosure system. We don't routinely go around and do surveys of houses, even at the point of sale or lease, which would be basic and obvious and has been going on for well over 20 years across Europe. We have no clue. So how do we know what we've got to do? There's a lot of kind of top-down studies, telling us what the cost curves are and how easy it is, but actually, when you get into the dwelling, it's all different. Somebody's come in, mucked it about. Unless you have a specialist go in and actually kick the tires, you will not know. We have to do that work. We have fridge labelling. Why don't we have house labelling? It isn't rocket science. Yes, it's costly. Yes, you could spend that money on doing retrofit. Yes, 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 but you don't know what to do and you will waste that money. I can guarantee it. So disclosure is a big one, a really big one. And this means trusted, high-quality information. It needs to be to meet the legal test of if you're a tenant, or you're a landlord, or you're a purchaser, or you're a seller, you can rely on that information. It's not a checklist that a seller filled in to make themselves feel good. That's not going to work. So that's a big one. I think setting the rules of the game, and it kind of is about this values question. Instead of us getting tangled up in the price of timber, we really need to rethink this whole thing. And that has to be done collectively. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody, at Chippies. I'm not pointing the finger at Bunnings. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone here. I'm saying, actually, we're done with all of that. We actually need to get in a room and figure out how we're going to do this, how we're going to reset the rules of the game. And again, I'm not even pointing the finger at regulators. I actually think that this is an imbricated system. Regulators do what they do within the limits of the politics and the position in which they find themselves. Housing is splintered. It's across jurisdictions. It's across, as I said, typologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't pretend it's not. We need to accept that it is something that is very much embodied, heterogeneous, complex. And I think that the watchwords, in my mind, going forwards for circular economy housing, we're not going to get this right. We're not going to get it done as quickly as we need to. Our durability, we really need to think about durability. Obviously design, I kind of take it for granted that we really need to fix our building codes, and that's taken way too long. We're miles behind. I even have a story I'll tell you later about how far we are behind on basically building codes. And I think we need to think about the distribution of living spaces. And that might sound obvious, but how many spare bedrooms have we got? How many, so this is something that housing affordability advocates live and breathe, but it's not been part of the circular economy discourse, and it needs to be. The distribution of housing, access to living space needs to be a central part of the circular economy equation. It can't come down to researchers like me sitting in boxes doing LCAs. Actually has to be engaged with the need for housing. I think I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ralph. Look, abuse is a strong word, but I appreciate you winding up and keeping it nice and succinct. There's a lot in this research, as you've indicated, and of course across the rest of today, we're going to be unpacking some of the detail in some of those parts of the quadrant that you've referred to. So that is how we've framed the day, so we will get to spend more time on that. What we're going to do now is have a Q&A session, and I do just also want to let you know that the slides that we've seen today will actually be available to all of you who've registered for the conference, including the people online. So I noticed a few people taking pictures and things. You don't need to do that. You will actually have access to those slides later on. All right, so I think we've got a couple of mics. Yes, Susanna's got one at the back and Jen has one as well. So those of you in the room, just we'll do that by raising your hand and people will come around. But just while we're getting sorted, perhaps get the first couple of people lined up. Lisa, I thought I'd ask you just if you have any initial thoughts or response to Ralph's presentation. I'd give you the right of reply if you like and to highlight anything you thought might be interesting or worth talking about further.
Thanks, Tom. Well, that was great. And I love your concept that we just need to double the life of housing stock. I mean, how simple is that? Right, there's a lot to unpack to make that happen. My other reflection was around the database and the information tracking, what's in the houses, how do we measure that? And I think, 5, 10 years ago, we didn't have the technology to do that. But we have the traceability technology now. We know traceability is a really big part of circular economy. Very much integrated into the EU's framework, and we're going to see their strategy around traceability come out, and it applies to all resources. In Australia, we have our own homegrown Everledger, which is the Ann Kemp's company, which has been tracing diamonds, for example. And this has been very important to understand the quality, the trusted data. And in fact, that traceability net scheme has been used during the Ukraine-Russia war to track the diamonds there. So we know that the technology is there to trace materials. We just need to start to understand how important it is to value what we have. And this goes to anything coming into our economy, because let's face it, materials are going out and most of what we need comes in through imports at the moment. So we have to have a big grip on it. And I know the examples I'm giving aren't directly in the housing sector, but this is where it has been done before. We know, for example, black mass, which is our batteries melted down, contain all these critical minerals we need. And Europe has just declared it a hazardous material purely because it wants to keep it on shore. It doesn't have the infrastructure at scale to recycle it yet. You can see the analogy that I'm making, but it's keeping those resources there. In Australia, south coast of New South Wales, we have a huge timber carpentry, highest carpentry per capita and woodworks per capita in Australia. So there's a huge amount of timber there. It goes to landfill because of different regulations around paint on it and contamination and things like that. So we've got the frameworks here to start to redo things. We've got the evidence base, and really the next thing, there's markets failing, we need government, and then we need some bravery. We need all of us to say, right, we're going to give this a go. So that would be my reflections, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. All right, I think we had a question over here, was it? Did I see one? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Did I see a question over here? Sorry. No, I didn't. Oh, there's one there.
As part of the review of the inquiry, did you look at the building materials that are currently being used in Australia or have been used for the last 100 years? Asbestos being the main one. So you talk about doubling the life of properties.
Yeah.
Retrofitting a property with asbestos in it is not cheap.
Yeah. Great question, and it kind of brings us down to earth, if you like. It's a solid question, so I'll take the question in the spirit in which it's meant. First of all, I'd say we only looked at 4 key building materials. We did not attempt to do a full, sort of analysis of the historical stock. I think to take your point, on face value, I'm outside Victoria at the moment, so I can probably say Victorian government has announced that the plan is to knock down 44 housing towers. My response to that would be, it's a generalised answer to your question. Of course, it does not make sense for us to automatically double the life of all the housing stock we've got. There's no doubt that a chunk of the housing stock we have needs to be knocked down, and those materials hopefully reclaimed as much as possible, and the rest of them need to be dealt with in a safe way. And we're not using asbestos in building, as far as I know, and we shouldn't. So they're kind of the obvious parameters here. What we don't know fully, because of the lack of a housing database, is how many of the how much of the existing housing stock is actually unserviceable. So that's a big question. But clearly, economics drive this activity at some level. We haven't got the economic settings quite right yet, but in the case specifically of hazardous materials, I think it's right for us to take a risk-averse view to retrofit or retention of those properties that have those materials in them. Coming back to the towers, I mean, I don't have a starting view. I'm an academic, so I would say this, about whether the towers should be knocked down and rebuilt or not. But I do have a view about what kind of evidence, how open it should be, how accountable it should be, that decision should be based upon. And there should be full carbon life cycle assessment, verified, peer-reviewed, scrutinised by awkward people like myself. And we have a right, the community have a right to know on what basis these decisions are to be made and to be involved in those decisions in some way, even if it's through the ballot box, but in some way, shape or form, perhaps a little bit more sophisticated than voting once every few years. So my own view is that, and it comes back to my point about the community conversation, one of the reasons we're not doing very well in circular economy housing is that none of us actually know really what it means, and none of us have been we haven't come together around a common understanding, like we have on many other topics. We just haven't done it. So I do feel that, to use that example of the towers, we really need to take it as an opportunity to shift the Overton window, the kind of what is possible in the kind of public sentiment from, I need money to buy a house, live in it, and sell it to somebody for a profit. We need to go from a way of imagining and thinking about housing to another way of imagining and thinking about housing. And we need to do that collectively and respectfully. And I think that involves transparency, accountability around data and information.
And Lisa, I'm going to ask you one of the questions that's come through from our online audience. You spoke quite a bit about your role in processes that are being led by the federal government and the federal minister. There's a question here about the role of local government, I think from somebody who's from that sector, and they're interested in to know, I guess, what you think that sector, that level of government should be doing, and perhaps even just your top three or top one thing that local government could do.
Great question. And obviously, systems transitions, we need all the sectors to work together at the same time. And local government, in many ways, has been leading. They're at the forefront of this. They're dealing with the waste coming out of households and commercial industry, etc. So a couple of years ago, we produced a report with ISF on and UTS on how to create circular economy hubs. So this is really great opportunities for local councils to start to understand the waste streams that are bespoke to their area. How can they start to create clean stream collections? What's the infrastructure available to them? And we're starting to see a lot of the ROCs come together. So Riverina ROC, which is a collection of councils, the Hunter JOs, joint organisations, are also coming together. They've looked at, actually done some evaluation, because councils don't have huge resources, not all of them. So aggregating these councils together, they've looked at what's the gross regional product of circularity in the Hunter, particularly in the terms of transitioning away from extraction industries into circular industries. There's lots of opportunities that councils can leverage around stakeholder engagement, awareness raising, as we've identified and talked about, what is circular economy. And once you learn about that, it's very hard to unsee it. There will be some training courses that the EPA is actually advertising. We're working with these training courses for local government in New South Wales. So that's one opportunity. And Circular Australia is going to be doing more training. So there's just some examples of local government. They've got their IP&R frameworks. which is their ability to build in projects, to put in their circular economy goggles and lenses, targets. They also have policies which they can use for that. And even just understanding the, what's that sort of situation and policy and objectives of the council, how can they add in circularity that?
Thanks.
I'm going to add a point there. If you
Okay, go
got
for
a
it.
minute.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Local governments, I think, are very much at the forefront and bearing the brunt, as it were, having to deal with construction demolition waste, and have been really innovative in diverting as much as they can from landfill testing, using. I mean, there's been one or two bad examples recently, and it's cropped up I won't mention it, but road base, pavements,
Yep.
park benches, the kind of thing. And I mean, I think there are gaps in the system, and it does come back to the splendid nature of local government. So being able to reliably look at how something works in another local government and in those climate conditions, in those contexts, and be able to translate that into one's own local government. That I think is really tricky for local governments on very limited resources.
Thanks. Yes, we have a question over here. If someone can get a microphone. Oh, sorry. You go. You go over here. Go, Jen. We'll go here, and then Mike will take you after that. Thanks.
First of all, I will disclose that my dog ate the homework. And I don't even have a dog. But I will ask my question. When it comes to building capacity, skills, knowledge and training, they're that quadrant. I mean, one of the things I think about is our engagement. I'm a community housing provider, CEO of Homes North Community Housing, engaging with builders. And, if you think about where we can start now, so we're stopping the problem for the future, is getting to builders before they become builders. And in their mindset is circularity, because it's really hard when you're engaging with the construction industry now to try and get other outcomes when they have these business models that are, any disruption to their business model and sometimes not even interested. And secondly, then you're just adding up to your costs immediately. And so I think that's, getting to the new builders, the ones that are coming through, so they don't think any other way. That is how they think. And if you've got the regulation and everything else happening at the same time, then they will work with it. Because what happens now with a lot of the, longer term builders that we're dealing with that have got these really lean, mean kind of production of spec builds, they don't want to disrupt that. That's how they make their, themselves commercial. So, getting to those new builders. And the problem with builders that when you put the regulation, the codes in now, they work to the absolute minimum of it. There's no investment in it except that they have to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, I would resist. I try to resist finger pointing. Having kind of done work previously for AHURI about a decade ago on kind of lived experience of building processes in volume housing. That really opened my eyes to the. I was going to use an expletive, but the kind of world they live in, and it's an undercapitalised subcontractor-based industry. There's no room to move. And like I said, you only need a spike in materials and you're out of business, pretty much. And that goes for even some of the larger, more integrated builders themselves. So I have a lot of empathy for where people are at with skills and conduct and performance. And that's partly why I come back to this system perspective that we really, RMIT, we produce a lot of trades training. And it's our responsibility to do exactly what you're saying, along with the rest of the training sector, with the apprenticeship system and so on. But also then to kind of work in concert with those building code shifts, with those pricing shifts, so that in concert we don't end up with all the pressure sitting in one part of the system. or the finger pointing, as I call it. So I think it's a great question, and it really brings to light the complexity that we're facing in working on this systemic change.
Well, government, I mean, education, absolutely right, starts with education. But the government's announcement just last week before last, around procurement is a really great start, because now we do need government to act, we need industry to act too, but this is a space that needs government direction, frameworks and recommendations and regulations. So I think that once we start to have the right settings in place, then investment follows, and we'll start to see new business models that can provide alternative solutions, circular solutions. So it is that process, and it's going to take a while.
Thank you. Mike's question down here, thank you.
Thank you. Mike Allen, Chair of Link Wentworth Community Housing here in New South Wales. Given the power and influence of governments and their expenditures, have there been any discussions on CE in regard to what will be the single largest construction program we've seen in our country for many decades, through the HAF and through the Housing Accord? Have there been any discussions of implementing CE principles? And if not, what could be some of the practical steps that governments and housing providers like mine could consider as part of their implementation of the program?
Lisa.
Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of government, but I can provide some feedback in terms of my role on the Ministerial Advisory Group. And absolutely, our circular economy is now very much a discussion point and a framework through which the government's working to create, and we will see that framework announced at the end of this year. There's an interim report which I gave some extracts of earlier, so that's worth having a look at. I think it's a combination of carrots, sticks and tambourines. So government will have some incentives. There'll be some tough talk too, particularly around, I mean, we're starting to see around recycled content, and then we'll start to see more extended producer responsibility coming. But I think industry has got a big role to play, and I think that's something I'm happy to take offline and talk in terms of what Circular Australia could do to support the industry and companies like yours to engage in circularity. There's lots of different things, some of which I talked about today, around dematerialising and other things, setting targets. But then there's also a bit of bravery that is required. I mean, we need to get together to create new supply chains. Circular Australia's done that in different sectors where we were able to put our arms, we're a not-for-profit, so we put our arms around players in a supply chain to get them to work together to de-risk, but to create a better outcome, a different outcome. So there's lots of different ways in which opportunities to engage with the circular economy. It starts with understanding what it is. And the thing is about circular economy, you can't unsee it. I mean, you learn this about the minerals and the value of these resources, and then you're thinking, well, hang on, how can I do that differently? Doesn't mean we can all act immediately, because we do need government support here. Finance has to follow. But I do think there's a big piece around being brave and saying, you know, okay, I'm not going to demolish X number of buildings. I'm going to set a target now for refurbishment and understand what that looks like when I, do the economic modelling against that. And where are those externalities I can add in that are benefits for me and potentially new revenue models or savings? So no one answer, but happy to take that offline and talk further.
Did you have anything to add to that, Ralph?
Yeah, one thing, again, it's an oblique response to your question, I'm afraid. I wish I could give you a direct response, but I'm not in that circle, so if it is a circle indeed. There is a history of major public sector investments driving innovation. Yep. It's too good an opportunity to miss, and they generally have succeeded in the past. And post-war Australia is a good example of just shifting the whole housing model and system of production. We're facing something like that, if not bigger. It's a straight up and down obvious case, I would say, for de-risking the entire housing sector by leading the way and demonstrating things can be done, bringing down that kind of learning rate, which has a cost, by investing in modern methods of construction and delivery.
And the risks are growing.
We just haven't understood them yet, and the risks getting greater and greater as resource costs and geopolitics changes our supply chains and impacts on that.
Great, thank you. Well, both of those responses to that question, I think, were a lovely way to end this session. We now have morning tea out in the lobby area. Please be back at 11, thank you, for the second session where we'll explore these issues further. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.